Selgitasin meie austatud arutelu osalistele, et siia on kogunenud need inimesed, kes Eesti ühiskonnas asju päriselt otsustavad. Aet ja Terje on nagu alati suutnud teid kõiki siia kohale meelitada, meie võrratud esinejad ja meie suurepärane publik. Nii et väga loodan, et selle 88 minuti ja 40 sekundi vältel, mis meil on praegu jäänud, me suudame katta nii keerulist maastikku, nagu seda on andmed, isikuandmed, nende andmete kasutamine, tehnoloogiahiiud, puudutada seda, mida austatud justiits- ja digiminister Liisa Pakosta oma avakõnes ütles, et me suudame pakkuda, ja loodan, et koos teiega, olge aktiivsed, selleks on siin seadeldis, mille ma varsti tooli alt välja võtan, et me suudame pakkuda vastuseid nendele väga olulistele küsimustele, et kelle oma on digitaalne maa ja kelle oma see peaks olema. Digitaalse maa all me peame silmas platvorme, online-turgusid, andmeid, algoritme. Kelle omad need on? Kelle omad need peaks olema? Kelle omad on andmed? Ja kelle omad nad peaks olema? Kui vabalt tohib neid kasutada? Kas neid tohib inimestelt välja pressida? Kuidas kaitsta kuritarvituste eest? Ja samas, kuidas andmepõhiselt teha inimeste elu paremaks? Olgu meditsiinivaldkonnas või tagada see, et ei juhtuks välditavaid õnnetusi ja et meil oleks turvaline olla. Samuti püüame vastata küsimusele, et kes otsustab ja kes peaks otsustama, kes on üldse seal, kus kaasajal peamine infovahetus käib, ehk näiteks sotsiaalmeediaplatvormidel, et kes seal üleüldse nähtav on. Kas peab jätkuma see, millest paljud eksperdid kirjutavad, et kõige kõvem valuuta nähtavuse saavutamiseks on raev, hirm, inimeste üksteise vastu ässitamine, vandenõuteooriad, mida hullem, seda parem. Näiteks hiljutine, võib-olla olete kuulnud, USA-s levib vandenõuteooria, et lumi, mis on maha sadanud ootamatult, et see kõik on plastik ja nähtavasti demokraatide vandenõu. Et võtate leeklambi, hakkate sulatama, näete ise, muutub mustaks. Mis juhtub sageli, kui see on segunenud tänavatolmuga. Millest veelgi jaburam vandenõuteooria, mida ehk ka kuulsite, oli koroona ajal, et milleks oli vaja sulgeda inimesed kodudesse, aga selleks, et vahetada tuvidel patareisid. Sest tuvid, nagu me teame, on luurajad. Ja ma ei hakka isegi rääkima juttudest, mida levitati, kasutades sotsiaalmeediaplatvorme, et mRNA-vaktsiinid on mõeldud milleks? Selleks, et süstida meisse kõikidesse kiip. Kes nalja ei mõista, siis märgin, et kõik see oli iroonia, nali ja soovitan seda nii ka võtta. Ja asi on selles mõttes tõsine, et Brexit vist ei juhtunud mitte sellepärast, et britid, aga siin me saame küsida, mida eksperdid arvavad ja teavad, et britid seda läbimõeldult soovisid, vaid sellepärast, et sotsiaalmeediaplatvormid olid niiviisi disainitud ja keegi teine soovis seda. Või kas just seda, võib-olla lihtsalt seda vara, mille sa saad klikkidest ja tähelepanust. Ja loodan, et jõuame arutada ka võimu jaotust. Võimule valitute, olgu nad parlamendiliikmed, president, valitsuse liikmed, ehk siis rahva mandaadiga võimule valitute ja tehnoloogiahiidude käes. Et kuidas on see võim nende vahel jagatud ja kas see peaks niimoodi olema? Siin hiljuti ka soomlased rääkisid, ja ega Eestis pole pilt parem, aga austatud minister saab soovi korral kommenteerida, et riik on teinud ennast sõltuvaks suurte tehnohiidude pilveteenustest ja kui kellelgi peaks tekkima mõte ja tänu väga suurele poliitilisele mõjuvõimule, mille on tehnohiidude omanikud saavutanud, eriti USA-s, aga mitte ainult, et kui kellelgi peaks tekkima mõte kas või ähvardada sellega, et teie pilve kinni paneme, et palju siis digitaalsetest teenustest ja kogu meie ühiselust alles jääb. Aga need asjad ei ole ainult halvad. Meenutades veel kord pandeemiat, siis mäletatavasti just needsamad tehnohiiud keeldusid kaasa minemast valitsuste sooviga hakata inimesi mobiiltelefoni põhiselt kõikjal jälitama. Kuuldavasti tehnohiiud ütlesid, et ei, me ei ole nõus. Ja vestluse lõpus me püüame pakkuda ka lahendusi, kavandame selleks jätta vähemalt pool tundi ja siingi palun teilt aktiivset kaasalöömist. Ja lahendused ärgu olgu mustast meeleolust kantud. Nii nagu hiljuti ütles president Toomas Hendrik Ilves, meie täna siin käsitletava valdkonna kahtlemata briljantne tundja ja eestkõneleja, mitte konkreetselt tingimata selle valdkonna kohta, aga nii üldiselt, et vaadake, halamine ei aita. Asjad on nii, nagu nad on ja tuleb leida lahendus. Ja see lahendus ei peaks olema 1961. aastal etendunud muusikali pealkirjast, et peatage maailm, tahan maha, vaid katsume ikka intelligentselt niiviisi, et läheme uuendustega kaasa ja samal ajal katsume seda teha nii, et meie inimõigused, põhivabadused ja nende tagatisena demokraatlik õigusriik koos võimude lahususega alles jääb. Nüüd siit ongi hea edasi minna meie austatud panelistide juurde. Ja me oleme korraldanud oma töö niiviisi, et kõigepealt igaüks neist saab võrdlemisi lühidalt, nii umbes 5 minutit, soovi korral avaldada oma mõtteid, sest need nurgad, millest me sellele väga keerulisele ja avarale probleemide puntrale läheneme, on meil kõikidel erinevad. Et meie teadustöö, uurimistöö, praktilise igapäevatöö, kogemused ja teadmised on erinevad, see on suurepärane, et Aedal ja Terjel on õnnestunud teid siia kohale meelitada, nii et ma loodan, et seda teadmist õnnestub siin jagada. Pärast igaühe sõnavõttu on kõigil panelistidel võimalik kommenteerida üksteise mõtteid väga lühidalt, esitada küsimusi, sama võimalus on teil, kallid kuulajad. Ja siis on niisugune palve, et me oleme siin kõik erinevatelt elualadelt. Ja nagu te teate, siis mina olen siin tükk aega selle selge sõnumi patroonina tegutsenud. Ma palusin paneliste, kuigi nad on võimelised esinema fantastilisest teaduskeeles, kiirgama eruditsiooni, nii et me kõik säraksime sellest paistes, aga ma palusin seda mitte teha. Et hoiame jutud maalähedased, et saaks natukene nalja sellel kargel talvepäeval, toome elulisi näiteid ja kuna online ülekannet ei ole, siis me saame seda endale ka lubada. Ei pruugi juhtuda see, mida minu vanavanaema alati hoiatas, et suu toob suure seljatäie. No nii, alustaksin Stefania teiega. Me kõik oleme tõenäoliselt sotsiaalmeedia platvormide kasutajad. Me teame, et mida need tähendavad näiteks kaasaja poliitilistes aruteludes, mida need tähendavad valimisvõitluses, mida need tähendavad siis, kui kohtumenetlus pole veel alanudki, aga üks osa ühiskonnast otsustab kellegi ära tühistada või mõne firma näiteks pankrotti ajada, sest kuskil levib kuulujutt. Et teie olete seda uurinud ja seepärast esimesena annakski teile sõna, et kõnelda sotsiaalmeedia platvormide omanike taotlustest, mõjust ja võib-olla teisipidi ka sellest, et kuidas mitmed valitsused eesotsas ebademokraatlike riikide valitsustega püüavad omakorda samu meetodeid oma rahva vastu kasutada. Stefania, palun.
Thank you very much for the invitation and also for the questions. We have a lot to unpack in a very short time, and as you said, this is a topic that can be approached from different angles. We'll try to do this here, and my focus, as you said, has been mostly the regulation of online platforms. And you mentioned some words earlier with respect to incidents that have occurred, distribution of power. So I would like to take a step back from this point, because indeed the regulation of social media is a regulatory priority. We're seeing it at the EU level, at the national level, in some countries. But I wanted to take a step back to explain how we got here and why we're facing this problem today. Mm-hmm. So traditionally, freedom of expression has always been, the protection of the right to freedom of expression has been a relationship between the state and the individuals. So the state detained the power and the individuals had some means to contrast this power. With the emergence of social media, we have seen a change in how freedom of expression is exercised. We don't have just one pole of power with the state and then the other with the individuals. We have a third one with the online platforms. Today, through their own infrastructure, so the platforms themselves infrastructurally and the rules that they enact on those spaces, they effectively regulate what we say, how we express ourselves, the sort of information that we access online. And this has repercussions not only on freedom of expression and access to information, but also to a wide variety of other human rights, because freedom of expression is an enabler for the exercise of other human rights. So then we have our right to vote that is affected through the information that we access. We have our right to health that is affected, again, through the sort of things that we see online, and the vaccine disinformation was mentioned earlier as well. So what we're seeing today is essentially the governance structure of freedom of expression that is completely different, with a center of power being detained by online platforms themselves. Now, there have been efforts in trying to tame these platforms, and the latest addition is the EU Digital Services Act, which is a regulation that tries to impose obligations on online platforms, online giants. And I think we can partially see the EU Digital Services Act as a human rights instrument. In some ways, it contains some human rights obligations for platforms, and it is interesting to see also the relationship of these platforms with the regulation itself. So initially, when the DSA was proposed, platforms were somehow cooperative. They wanted to cooperate with the European Commission. We need to fix it. Of course, we need to protect human rights online. And now we are seeing a shift in their own attitude towards the DSA. We have seen it especially in the past months, but crucially from the beginning of the second Trump administration. The Digital Services Act is now framed as a censorship tool, as a way for the EU to control how we express ourselves and what we can say online. And so the regulation is under attack, first by platforms, then by the Trump administration, and now, more worryingly, by some European governments and some European forces. I think that this is a very important point, because here what we're seeing is a sort of manipulation of the concept of freedom of expression to actually restrict rights. The attacks on the DSA are based on this idea to protect free speech, but in fact, without regulation, what we're seeing is what we're seeing now with X and Grok, meaning hate speech online, child sexual abuse material online generated through AI. We're also seeing reduction of protection on content policies on Meta, for instances, where protection for women and marginalized communities have been removed from the content policies and standards, meaning it's perfectly fine to engage in hate speech. And so this is particularly worrying because the human rights language is being mobilized to reduce human rights. As for the solution, I would start and then we can expand on this a little bit more. I think one of the main things that unfortunately hasn't been tried is to unleash the power of the Digital Services Act. I think the European Commission has been relatively shy in enforcing it, and I also think that the DSA should give more power to all other stakeholders, including civil society organizations, including national human rights institutions, so that they can counterbalance the power that even through the DSA still remains in the hands of platforms. And I'll stop here, but we can continue later. Thank you.
Ja siin ongi see koht, kus arutelukaaslased saavad kommenteerida või küsida, kui nad soovivad. Ma nägin, et Kristof, teie siin tegite juba märkmeid.
I think I will get back to you later.
siis tahtsin mina ise küsida karmi küsimuse, et miks peaksid näiteks sotsiaalmeediaplatvormide omanikud olema huvitatud sellest, et nende algoritmid on kujundatud nii, et ühiskonnas ei tehta nõrgematele liiga, et inimesi ei ässitata tühja-tähja pärast üksteise vastu üles, ei anta väga kahjulikke nõuandeid, et miks nad peaksid seda tahtma. Ja teine küsimus, mida võib-olla ka Nele oskab vastata, et kas ikkagi äkki nende tehnoloogia platvormide ja nende firmade, keda võetakse kokku sõnadega big tech, et kas äkki nende võim ka poliitikute juures on kasvanud liiga suureks ja kas äkki mitte nemad ei hakka dikteerima, millal me peame mõistma inimõigustena?
Should I answer now?
Yes, please.
Yes. So with respect to the algorithms and the recommender systems, I mean, the main issue with these platforms is their business model. And this is why, one of the pushes is also we should regain power and have more European companies doing this instead. But I'm not sure that this is the solution, in the sense that insofar as the business model is a business model that is built on engagement, built on the idea that I need to stay there and scroll all the time in order to see more ads, whether the company is a US company or a European company or another company, the algorithm that will be used will be created in such a way as to create my addiction to the platform itself. So I think, they don't put in place any other algorithm because they don't have any business incentive or reason to do so. And this is the reality. These platforms, even if they present themselves as we are giving people a voice, we are giving you the freedom to express yourself, they're not doing this. They're only making money through advertisement. And if from perhaps Christoph can jump on it, from a cognitive perspective, hate speech is what keeps people scrolling instead of happy things, then this is the content that will be pushed so that we remain attached to it. But the main reason is money, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm happy to ask a question as well. So it's about what the Grok example tells us, that if even in that most extreme case of literal child sexual abuse, child sexual imagery appearing on the platform, and that the regulatory bodies, polities, countries are not immediately addressing that, what does that tell us about the regulatory framework and about the technology?
Absolutely. I think this is quite a sort of something that I found personally deceiving from the European Commission, because we have seen, there have already been many issues and tensions between X specifically and the European Commission. Already in December, the European Commission gave fines, a 120 million fine to X for failing to comply with the DSA. Then Trump and Elon Musk both attacked the DSA, saying this is a censorship machine and we should deregulate and so on and so forth. So there is already a history of violations from the specific platform. And now we have something that is way more serious than the lack of transparency, compliance with the transparency obligation, the blue check mark on X. We are talking about actually child sexual abuse content that is flooding the platform. It's generated using real people. It's just horrifying. And so far, the only reaction has been, yes, we are investigating. So they've launched that investigation. But ultimately, the DSA, and specifically Article 70, allows the European Commission to enact interim measures. And if we do not use interim measures in this instance, when we have child sexual abuse material online, where is the bar when we can actually say we unleash the power of the law and we're blocking access to this platform if we're not doing it for this. So I think this ultimately reveals also the lack of courage in a way from the European Commission because of also the entire political situation with the US and the tariffs and so on and so forth. So I think this is also sort of pushing for caution from the digital regulation, but at some point we have this very powerful instrument and we should probably deploy it to protect fundamental rights, which is what it was meant to do in the first place.
Ja üks väga hea küsimus on juba jõudnud ka kuulajate käest ja nimelt, et kui käib võitlus Ameerika ja Hiina ja me loodame, et ka Euroopa vahel, et see on ju see multipolaarsus, ilmselt on osalisi teisigi, et kas meie murede tuum võib olla selles, et Euroopa millegipärast ei ole suutnud luua omasuguseid sama võluvaid sotsiaalmeediaplatvorme, kus kehtiksid meie eetilised standardid ja meie arusaam inimõigustest. Sest muuhulgas selles multipolaarses ja muutuvate jõuvahekordadega maailmas käib ju võitlus ka sellepärast, et kes defineerib inimõigused. Kas Hiina, Ameerika või Euroopa?
Yes, I mean, I think on this topic there is this excellent book by Anu Bradford that is called Digital Empires, which explains these three poles, the US, Europe, and China, with three different approaches to platform. And she explains convincingly, in my opinion, that the idea that the European regulation stifles innovation is inherently false. It's not true that because the ethical standard or the regulations imposed by Europe, we cannot develop good technology. There might be other reasons for this, but I don't think that it's because we have regulation that protects human rights, and she explains so. I mean, there might be other reasons that, I don't know, perhaps are linked to other questions, such as funding for universities, such as funding for research, such as funding for science, which is way more pushed in these other two parts than Europe. And this perhaps creates the sort of emptiness, in a way, for more technological development. I think this could be one of the reasons instead of the regulatory framework. I'm not sure whether, I think that one of the powers of the EU is precisely the fact that we have this framework and also the fact that we represent a huge market for these platforms. And so we should use and leverage our own our own territories and population and our numbers precisely to make sure that our human rights standards are protected and enforced, at least in Europe, and hopefully they will also expand in other countries. And I think that this is happening because some countries are now precisely thinking about using the DSA framework in their own legislation. Switzerland is currently discussing a legislation that is based on the DSA to protect freedom of expression online and imposing online obligations on online platforms. So I think the solution is, of course, perhaps to invest in science and research, but also to leverage our own market precisely to make sure that our own human rights standards are enforced first in Europe, and then hopefully other countries will follow our lead.
Aitäh, Stefania, ja see on nüüd see hetk, kus paluksin teatepulga üle võtta Bennil ja natuke, nii nagu me seda Rubiku kuubikut siit nüüd erinevate nurkade alt vaatame ja katsume teda kuidagi kokku saada, et siis võtta nüüd teise vaatenurga, mis tõukub teie uurimistööst ja lühidalt see on siis andmed, kõige laiemas tähenduses andmed, mis ühelt poolt võimaldavad kindlasti teha meie kõikide elu kogu maailmas palju paremaks. Innoveerida, ravida paremini, aga teiselt poolt nende andmete kaitse kuritarvituste eest on üha raskem, üha kulukam ja kas nii väga tahetaksegi, nii nagu me siin ennist arutasime, ja nad on ka üksjagu võimas relv kuritarvitajate käes. et kuidas leida seda mõistlikku tasakaalu. Palun.
Thank you. Yeah, the background I come from is thinking about economic and social rights, which include rights like health, housing, food, work, and those are really key rights as to how we live our day-to-day lives. I'm going to think about this through an example, because you asked for some examples, and I've got a very visual example, which is the watch I've got on my wrist. Many of you might have one similar, which are these smartwatches. It tracks everything about me. It tracks my heart rate. It tracks the spikes in my heart rate. It tracks how active I am in any given day. It tracks when I go to bed, when I get up, how long I nap for in the afternoon if I get a lazy weekend. It knows everything about me. And that, from a human rights perspective, can get us things. That can improve things. We can look at that data on an individual or a societal or even subgroup level. So we can look at, for example, men of color and their particular health implications. Maybe it's connected to their job or their level of activity. We can start to understand subpopulations and how to treat them better in a health context. Maybe how their work environment or the jobs that they tend to get tracked into are affecting their health, for example. So it's an incredibly potent tool just with that one piece of data I'm talking about. There are many, many, many elements of improving rights that we can get from those things. So in that way, it's really a sword we can use, and we can use it to hold all sorts of bodies accountable. We can use it to hold governments accountable, where we can see how population-level data isn't being addressed over time by governments. So previously, to understand that a health or a population or a community were having negative health outcomes, perhaps because of economic choices made by a government, we would have had to wait many years. We would have had to invest in really, really expensive longitudinal studies that looked at health as it changed over years and years and years in a huge amount of detail, lots of interviews, lots of understanding, sub-pockets within communities. Extraordinarily expensive, and in practice, just wasn't happening very often. There were some really good examples of it, but in many contexts, there just wasn't the resource or interest to fund that many studies to be able to hold a government accountable. And so what you end up with is economic implications, economic choices having implications, which we anecdotally know. We know that cutting funding for hospitals is going to have a negative impact on people, but we're not able to show it until we bring in that data. And once we bring in that data, all of a sudden, things happen much more quickly. We can understand the picture in a matter of weeks, months, years, rather than over a decade. And we can also do it with much more granularity. So for holding a government accountable, we have a really potent tool. It's also much, much cheaper to do that sort of analysis than it is to do those sorts of sociological studies. When we think about then how that translates into human rights protection, it means that organizations at the UN, the human rights treaty bodies, and at the EU, and national courts and human rights institutions have a tool that they can point to and use to hold governments accountable for their big macro choices in a much more fast, individual way. So that's the good news picture we get from just one piece of data. Of course, we all know that the data on our watch is the least of our concern. There's location data on our phones, and just walking into this building, we'll have set off maybe 100 data points, from heating sensors to a lighting sensor to all sorts. The downside, though, to all this data is it also can put something in the hands of governments and companies that they can use against me as an individual rights holder. So again, staying with my watch and all the data it collects about me, an insurance company might now be able to take a more negative view of me than it was able to in the past. An insurance company might refuse me certain types of insurance because it's understood me to be someone that isn't particularly active. Now, I might have very good reasons for not being particularly active. It might be to do with a disability, health condition, my job or my lifestyle might not allow me to be particularly active. But the insurance company is now able, through the data, to take a particular view of me and, in essence, take a more harsh, punishing view of me as a rights holder. And not just companies. Governments are also up to this, and they're very able to do it. Really, the governments are just catching up to the use of this data in the sort of scale that they're going to be able to. So if you think about social security payments, benefits payments, job seeker payments, governments will be able to, and are already doing, some using of the data to understand and track people's activity, and to use that to calibrate how much of a benefit payment they will receive, social security payment they will receive. If you're not doing the right thing, not hitting the right data targets, not hitting the right number of applications, etc., you will find yourself sanctioned, your benefits cut until they eventually, in some countries, hit 0 and you're left in destitution. Likewise, workers' rights are massively affected by this, both on a government level and on a company third-party level. As a worker, the days have already got more intense. Things are much more crammed in. Many of us don't manage our tea break in the morning, our lunch break in the middle of the day. Many of us work slightly longer hours. The day has got more intense. That's a consequence of many things, including greater digitalization. But now, with the addition of increased data points, this new data environment, everything we do can be tracked. So anyone who has the displeasure of using Microsoft Teams, see a few people with that trauma. Whenever you sit still for too long, your dot goes from green to yellow to red, telling everyone in your organization that you stepped away from your desk for 10 minutes. It gets more and more intense, and the monitoring gets more intense. That's, individual colleagues will now know what each other are doing. That's one aspect. But companies who own our data, because they own their subscription to Microsoft Teams, are able to aggregate that up. They're able to tell how many hours within a day I sit on green compared to a different colleague. They're able to tell where I'm working from. So my employer will know I'm here and not in the UK. And all of this, used badly, used without constraints, have real impacts on us as rights holders, as workers, or as healthy individuals, or as individuals in the social security state. So, without being too gloom and doom, I do think a lot of these are challenges that we have the frameworks to deal with. We understand that threats come in new forms and that things don't stand still. So I wouldn't argue that we need to throw out the rulebook. We don't need to start from scratch. I think what we need is new vigilance. We need to be on higher alert to understand the implications of some of these things. And in that new vigilance, again, not to throw things out, but to look for analogies of where we might learn from past applications of the rules.
Suurepärane, aitäh, Ben. Ja nagu ikka, esimene võimalus kiireteks kommentaarideks või küsimusteks on arutelukaaslastel. Stefania, Nele, Kristof, soovite midagi öelda?
Maybe I have a question. While listening to the presentation, I was thinking about, of course, I feel that the aspect of social and economic rights is somehow, sometimes a little bit, taken aside with respect to, compared to freedom of expression and so on and so forth. So it's incredibly interesting work, but at the same time, it made me also think of how interconnected, again, both political and civil rights and economic social rights are. I was reading again how the data that is being collected through our health apps, women, especially with their menstruation apps, is now actually being used by states to prosecute women because they can monitor whether a woman has had access to an abortion, where abortion in countries where abortion is now criminalized, and this has happened in the UK, this has happened in the US already. So also this data, it is indeed incredibly useful for us to, gather information and gather data to enforce and claim our own rights, but at the same time, it can actually be used from governments not only to deny our economic and social rights, but if some activity is ultimately criminalized, it can also lead us to imprisonment and the policing, the actual policing of our bodies and our data, and then arrest. So it just made me think on how this data can also be problematic, even from this other perspective, from a human rights perspective.
Yeah, thank you for your contribution. And also from my side, I think I would like to bounce back on multiple things you said, but it will be a little bit already in my oral presentation. So for now, I don't think I have a specific question, but I'd like to come back on it after my part. Maybe you have a question at the moment?
I'm wondering, though, especially with the data points. So we're talking about the examples, many examples in the US, perhaps. Doesn't the GDPR basically get at the examples that you are giving? Many of them, basically, I think, it does get at it. Is it the enforcement? What do you think really is, at what level do we have the problem? Is it the normative problem? Is it an enforcement problem? Is it a consent problem because I give consent too easily?
Yeah, the latter. To me, it's a consent problem. There are insurance companies that will tell you exactly what they're doing. They'll say, "Here's a free watch. Here's the perk of signing up with us as an insurer. You get a £200 Apple Watch for free." And people go, "Great, I'll have the free watch." And so, of course, they know to an extent, they're consenting to an extent. But I think the depth of understanding of how precise the data is, how much it can be embedded into a company's business model, is something that there's not quite the same level of understanding of yet, and that's maybe where the problem lies.
Kuulajatelt tuli väga hea tähelepanek, et eks siin ongi see tasakaalu otsimise koht, et kas valitsus laias tähenduses tahab teha andmepõhiseid, täpseid ja õiglaseid otsuseid nendes valdkondades, kus see on mõistlik, näiteks välja selgitada, et millistes peredes lapsed vajavad abi väärikal viisil, et välja selgitada, kus võib-olla on lähisuhtevägivald ja tarvis oleks abi, ja veelgi enam, et kes on näiteks need inimesed, kes päriselt vajavad hambaravihüvitist. Ka Eestis praegu minu teada kõikidele on ette nähtud pisikene summa hambaraviks, millest tegelikult raviks ei jätku. Aga kui oleks võimalik neid andmeid paremini kasutada, siis kindlasti oleks võimalik teha nii, et need, kes saavad endale igal aastal hambaarsti juures käimist lubada ja ise selle kinni maksta, et nemad seda hüvitist ei saa, aga need teised saavad jälle hüvitist piisavalt, et oma hambad tõesti korda teha. Nii et eks me seda tasakaalu peame ju kõik otsima, et ma juba näen, et Ben noogutab ja eks see vist see vastus ongi, et see on ju küsimus, mida lõpuks ühiskond ja tema rahvaesindajad peavadki siis otsustama, et kui täpseid, turvalisi, mugavaid otsuseid me tahame ja milliseid riske me oleme nõus selle nimel võtma. Sest neid halbu näiteid on ju küll, kus automaat või algoritm, mis peaks aitama leida need pered, kus oleks vaja rohkem lastetoetust, on üles ehitatud nii, et kõik need, kellel on varem riigiga olnud rohkem kontakte, näiteks sellepärast, et nad on sellesse riiki ülikooli järel elama asunud, et kõik need loetakse automaatselt kahtlaseks ja see viibki selle diskrimineerimiseni, mida me tegelikult püüame vältida nende tehisintellektide puhul. Ja võib-olla lihtsalt jällegi, et siin pinget kruvida, meil kahjuks ei ole lahtist mikrofoni vist. Mul ei ole lahtist mikrofoni, kui sealt tagant tuuakse, siis tekib see võimalus. Aga nii kaua, et kui rahvas on nõus, et siis on valju häälega õigus küsida inglise keeles küsimus. Palun. Jaa.
Eesti keeles, inglise keeles. I think
in English, please. In this case, yes.
Hello everyone, I'm Karl-Mati Sepp. I'm a Deputy Secretary General of Estonian Atlantic Treaty Association. And I would have a question regarding this. You know, all of these companies are profiting hugely from all of this data, right? But could there also be an opt-in system for people to say that, yes, I not only consent to this data being used, but you would also give me some amount of money for that type of data. So if we would actually build into the system that people, if they would be, because people are at the moment giving all of their rights away for free, right? So, but if we as a regular people could actually be making money from that side, do you think that that could be regulated, or that could be a welcome initiative from the company side? This isn't directed to anyone in particular, but perhaps to
Väga hea küsimus, võtan vastavalt põhiseadusele riigikeeles selle kokku, et kas ei peaks kõik need, kes meie kella pealt parasjagu loevad, et me siin kõik koos oleme ja arvatavasti kerges lavaärevuses, et kas nad ei peaks meile sendikese maksma või see jääbki nii, et maksad pool kuupalka kella eest ja siis lüpstakse sinu arvel raha veel täiendavaltki. Liisa, kas sa tahad ka inglise keeles rääkida?
That from Estonian side, so we actually have a bill ongoing that gives this opportunity to everybody through the state control from the data protection perspective only, so that people can sell their data to the private companies, having the regulation done in a properly way. So that bill is ongoing. This is only in regard of private companies in the way that you described.
Et ühesõnaga riigikeeles kokkuvõetuna Eestis on lahendus nii-öelda torus ja nüüd ongi hea kontsentreeruda küsimuse tagumisele osale, et mida meie need tehnofeodaalid sellest arvavad. Raha tahetakse ära võtta.
I can give you an answer from the UK perspective, which is they've tried exactly that. And the view of the companies was, well, the deal that we have at the minute is that adverts are the price of the platform. And so when they implemented it, actually they said, if you don't want us to use the data, you need to pay us. So the tech companies, the pop-up was, if you want us to stop using the data, you need to pay us a subscription of £3 a month or whatever. Then we'll take the data collection out, then we'll take the adverts out. So a platform free of adverts is a cost to them, and that's how they view it, rather than the other way around.
Et Nele töötabki, kes veel ei tea, et Nele töötabki nende regulatsioonidega, nii et Nele, palun.
Thank you very much. Coming back on your question, very interesting initiative, and I would like to learn more about it. What I can reply is from EU level, and also you might be familiar with an Austrian NGO called None of Your Business that has actually launched a procedure against what my colleague was just describing. So it would not be actually free consent if you have to pay for having access to the platform. So I tend to agree with that legal reasoning. This seems to be a promising best practice, but what I can say from EU level, there has been, end of last year, a new digital omnibus opened, which proposes changes to the GDPR and the AI Act, and the proposed changes in this GDPR, I would say, are not going in the direction that you are proposing. So I might come back to it later, but you asked if we were hopeful. I think there is still a long way we need to go, but I tend to agree with the issue you're raising.
Vot, nüüd ongi arutelu nii särtsakas, nagu ma lootsin, et see on. Et kohe tuli veel üks küsimus, palun, jah.
I have built-in application translation. My name is Lisa Past, and I do cybersecurity of nations and democracies. And to me, the practical technical question here is that our democracies and societies have decided not to opt out of this technically advanced, very networked way of globally living. And pretty much the corporations have us in the pocket. From a risk management point of view, which is the point of view that the EU takes, then the question is, who has your data? And it pragmatically becomes the choice between the hopefully like-minded US headquartered companies having your data versus the very unlikely like-minded companies that have to comply fully with the Chinese Espionage Act having your data. your watch is going to be either Apple or a Chinese make. And therefore, are we not being too idealistic? Isn't the pragmatic choice really whether we trust our bastards or bastards we know to be bastards when it comes to fundamental rights and our data?
aitäh! Lühike kommentaar?
I need to think about it.
Eks ta ole, ühesõnaga. Ja nüüd me saamegi liikuda Nele juurde. Ja Nele alustab minu teada tehnoloogia neutraalsuse põhimõttelisest võimalikkusest, nii et keerame sellel Rubiku kuubikul nüüd juba 3. külje ette. Palun!
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting and lively discussion so far. A lot of interesting topics we're touching upon. But indeed, after the 2 more academic point of views, I will come with a more practical point of view. So I'm working for the Belgian National Human Rights Institution, the equivalent of the organizer, and I'm also active at ENRI. ENRI is the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions. So 50 of these NHRIs are, their work on AI is being coordinated in a working group. And since 2022, both for the Belgian National Institution as ENRI, AI and emerging technologies have been a priority. The last year, we have been focusing more on the link of AI and securitization, so the AI arms race and national security, more geopolitical considerations, and now this year we will also focus a little bit more on the impact of AI and the rule of law. What was discussed earlier, given as an example of whether or not AI could be used to identify non-take-up of rights, but specifically the example of the dentist, that for some people there could be a financial contribution, and for other people another contribution. These are normative political decisions, and the issue that we want to give more attention to is, in the context of AI, we see public sector that is heavily reliant on the private sector that has a lot of the know-how, but also the physical infrastructure. And what we see is that normative decisions are actually being considered as mere technical choices, efficiency metrics, and actually being filled in by technical profiles. And in that way, they're not open to meaningful internal, external oversight, public scrutiny, but also judicial oversight of the executive branch. So this raises some questions in terms of rule of law. But now I will come back to the essence of my intervention. And discuss it a little bit more from what we are seeing on the ground. And Ben's example was brilliant in that sense. So what we see, there are a lot of institutions that receive like 10,000 complaints on a yearly basis or even more, but there are no people that are saying, hey, I think I'm victim of an AI-related human rights violation. It's just not happening. People do not realize when AI is being used, of when they know. They are on a social media platform. They do not necessarily know when the smartwatch gives certain information to the insurance, and which results then in a higher fee or something like that. People do not know when it happens, and even if they know that it happens, they do not know how the AI system behind it operates. When they know how it operates, so you have to already have a very high level of AI literacy, then people feel that the redress or the reparation you could achieve when you actually address this human rights violation is felt as disproportionate or not big enough in comparison to the financial, emotional, time, costs, and everything it entails to address, for example, big tech or public sector using technology from private sector. So this is what is called an information asymmetry, an information gap. There's also the power asymmetry, and the threshold gap is the feeling of not feeling that it's having the feeling that effective redress possibilities are merely theoretical. And so this is why we are we are advocating for meaningful transparency. And this is what we are seeing a lot of pushback. I think in the beginning, Stefania said it also in the context of the DSA. Private sector was very positive about AI regulation. We saw it also in the context of the AI Act, but now in the digital omnibus, we see already very much a push down on the very little transparency requirements that are there that do not even entail a strong administrative burden on the providers and deployers of AI systems. But also the importance of collective redress mechanisms. So civil society institutions, NHRIs, and other interested parties should be able to go to court even when there is no identified or identifiable victim. And why this is so important? Also, Ben alluded on it, but it's important that we look at this as not only, and with this I mean AI and emerging technologies, as causing individual harm. And let's have a look at a very well-known example, facial recognition technology. A lot of you will know that it's less accurate, it can be less accurate for minority groups when the training on which the system is trained is not sufficiently representative. So imagine someone from Estonian ethnicity being wrongfully recognized and arrested in Brussels based on faulty facial recognition technology. This person will suffer individual harm, but not only this person, but all people from Estonian ethnicity risk to be wrongfully detained. So there is also this collective damage, even if the harm has not yet occurred, and it is hypothetical harm. And thirdly, there is societal level harm. We all have an interest, whether we're of Estonian ethnicity or another ethnicity, to live in a society where everyone is treated equally. And the same goes for the threats to democracy, rule of law, the environment, freedom of opinion and polarization. These are more the societal level harms. And this is why am I already nearing the end of my allocated speaking time?
You can follow.
Okay. But okay, then I'll try to be very brief. So the question was also what we do in terms of advocacy, but I can relate to the previous speakers in terms of the challenges when what we are trying to do is ensure that there is a meaningful human rights-based approach to legislation, implementation, and oversight. And we're also struggling with this efficiency narrative, the techno-solutionism, the very much ingrained belief that technology can solve all of our societal problems, but resources are scarce, and it's not necessarily that technology can solve all of our problems. To the contrary, it has already been contributing to exacerbating existing societal inequalities. We have the false binary of regulation stifling innovation, the national security, and threats in the arms race. But another, and this will be the last point, another element that I think it's interesting maybe to draw your attention on is that so AI is complex. It's new, there is opacity, it's used on mass scale, and it's not easy to regulate. So the legislators globally went, most of them, for a risk-based approach. This risk-based approach is mostly product safety legislation that is measured through technical standards. And within this very product safety legislation, we also try to integrate human rights protection, and to a certain extent, protection of society. And what is important, so then you have all these requirements, it can be risk management system, impact assessment, but also very socio-technical requirements, a human rights impact assessment, or human oversight. And one of our major concerns is, okay, now we have the legislation, which is a very good thing. There are good things. There are prohibited practices, high-risk systems. But now there is the very, very likely possibility that whomever is going to see whether or not these requirements are met only have technical capabilities. And these will be the persons that need to assess whether or not a companionship chatbot is possibly manipulating you or your political opinion. So I think the message of this point is that whilst, of course, technical expertise is necessary, within implementation and oversight, human rights expertise is also fundamental. So thank you for your attention.
Näen palju noogutajaid ja ise olen esinoogutaja, nii et suur aitäh. Ja siin on kohane luua sild Nele ja Kristoffi mõtteavalduste vahel ja väikeseks ärgituseks, mis tegelikult on kurb, aga katsun rääkida lõbusas võtmes, kui see nüüd kõik tõsi on. Ja tasakaalu mõttes ka. Euroopa firma kuuldavasti on sõlminud lepingu USA-ga, konkreetsemalt siis kuulsa migratsioonipolitseiga, mida tähistab lühend ICE eesti keeles, selleks, et müüa neile tehnoloogiat, mille nimi on Advanced Skip Tracing. Tähendab siis seda, et kasutades kõiki kättesaadavaid erasektori ja avaliku sektori andmeid, välja selgitada varasema liikumise, suhtluse, kui kätte saab siis pangatehingute, küünetehnikute ja kõigi teiste info pinnalt, et kuhu võis see migrant, keda Ameerika valitsus parasjagu tahab kinni püüda, näiteks keegi naine, kes on põgenenud kartellivägivalla eest, aga mitte just seaduslikult üle piiri tulnud, et kuhu tema võis minna. Sellest tuli kõnealuses Euroopa Liidu liikmesriigis paras skandaal, nii et kas see leping jõustumiseni jõuab või mitte, seda me ei tea, aga see on jällegi üks näide, kus väga hea, kui sul on palju andmeid, aga kas me ei peaks jääma tõesti truuks sellele, et andmekogud on hajutatud, et riigi rahvaesindus, arvestades inimõigusi, on otsustanud, milleks neid tohib üldse kasutada ja edasi peaks olema ka ettevõtjatel oma eetilised standardid. Sest vaata, osa inimesi võib mõelda, ja minul on väga kahju, kui nad nii mõtlevad, et on ju tore, kui need ebaseaduslikult riiki saabunud migrandid kätte saadakse, kinnipidamiskeskusse torgatakse ja siis välja lükatakse. Meie siin inimõiguste kaitsjatena peaksime siiski mõtlema nii, et need, kes päriselt olid ohus sealt, kus nad tulid, et neid ei peaks sinna ohtudesse tagasi saatma, et see pole lihtsalt inimlik. Ja vaadake hästi, et võib-olla suur osa ühiskonnast lepib, eriti kui need algoritmid ja sotsiaalmeedia seda ka toetab, sellega, et jah, et migrante tulebki jahtida võõraid. Võõrad välja, iroonia jälle. Aga järgmisena võib-olla võtaks ette opositsioonipoliitikud. Ja siis võib-olla puuetega inimesed. Ja siis muidu ebameeldivad inimesed. Ja vaba ajakirjandus, see on ka igale korralikule valitsusele pomm jala küljes, puhas tüli. Nii et igaüks võiks ju, ja see kõik muidugi on jälle iroonia, ma jaoks lõutan, et igaüks võiks ju ette kujutada lisaks sellele, mida head saab teha, ka seda, mida halba saab teha. Sest kahjuks kipub olema nii, et kui midagi saab teha, siis võib juhtuda, et tehaksegi. Ja selle kurva loo lõpetuseks siis ma loodan, et see on linnalegend, aga kardan, et ei ole, sest lugesin lugupeetud väljaandest. Ameerikas nimelt keegi maalis oma jäetise auto külje peale ICE, mitte ice cream, vaid ice. Noh, nii nagu saksa keeles, eks ole, meie Kristoffiga teame, et ice on ice, eks ole, inglise keeles oleks ice cream. Ja õnnetuseks inimesed, kes selle tegevuse vastu protestisid, peksid vaese vennikese vaese omaks, enne kui nad avastasid, et ta vedas jäätist. Aga nüüd saame paluda Kristoffil jätkata ja natukene mulle tundub, et see ongi selle loodud silla teine ots, ehk siis mõttevabaduse hetkeseis ja võimalikkus, sest ajuti mulle tundub, et kõiges selles segases informatsiooni virvarris ja tühistamiskultuuris ja valede levitamises ja üksteise vastu ässitamises, et vahel seal tundub, et nagu kristlikud väärtused, mida mina isiklikult oma usuvabaduse raames kalliks pean, et kuidas sa pead oma ligimest armastama ja hoidma ja et ega mina ei ole Jumal, et mina otsustan, kes kõlbab meie sekka, kes ei kõlba või milline on see tähtsuse järjekord, et ka minu ülesanne on halastada, et siis mulle tundub kohati, et see halastus on ka võimatuks tehtud ja Kristoff on see teadlane, kes võib-olla teab, et kas see on lihtsalt nii, et tark ei ütle või on varsti nii, et tark enam ka ei mõtle.
So thank you very much. Let's see if I can get to that question at some point. So I thought with all this dystopian imagery around us, let me start with the good news. So there is a good news, and this is that there is a human right to freedom of thought, which all of you have, even though most of you may never have heard of it, but you still have it. It's an international human right. It's in all documents. Courts need to observe it. States need to respect it, to protect it, and to fulfill it. So that is a very good thing. Now, the problem with the right is that nobody really knows what it means. It has been around for a while, let's say since the Universal Declaration, that's almost 80 years, but it hasn't really been applied by courts. So I collect these cases worldwide, not many of them, and they don't really give us a good idea of what this right means. But if we look into the history, why has this right been adopted? There's an interesting story that has been a little bit forgotten. And the story was, now we are talking about the drafting of the Universal Declarations in 1947, 1948. The reasoning was that when they sat in the Commission of Human Rights and they tried to make out what are the bills of rights, what should we protect. So the idea was that there were some likely candidates like freedom of expression and food and shelter, but something might be forgotten, and that would be what one can say is part of the core of the person, which is the human mind. So the idea was that the individual is being exposed to so many pressures, social pressure, economic pressure, media pressure. That was the age of mass in society, increasing, that they thought, no, we need to protect the human mind in a sense. And so these debates were more a peripheral thing. Of course, that was past Second World War. People had different problems in a sense, but the idea was that we need to do something there, and out of these ideas arose the right to freedom of thought, which has been adopted under that name in the Universal Declaration. And the delegates also felt this is so important, let's make it an absolute right. So, this is a very particularly strong right. And since then, there is this right. They haven't really explained much more about it. And of course, freedom of thought is a broad notion. It echoes ideas of the Enlightenment and so on. But if you want to pin it down roughly in a prima facie kind of way, we could probably say it's the idea that people should be able to think for themselves, and that in a sense implies to not be influenced too much, a very rough approach. Also, because it has some connections to freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, there is the idea that people should not be forced to express their unexpressed thoughts. So this comes from the Inquisition and those kind of ideas, of course. So this is very roughly what this right means, and then it lay dormant in the documents. Nobody has used it really until a few years ago when there was a renewed interest in the right, and that has to do with emerging technologies, of course, and especially neurotechnologies. These are technologies that interact with the brain. You may have heard of them in the media. They're often in the news. So those technologies, they can basically measure brain signals, then try to infer information about the mental state, so what is a person feeling and perhaps also thinking. And they can also intervene into the brain by, for instance, electrically stimulating it. And this is in use in medicine for a long time. But those technologies have been gotten much better in recent years, of course, because of AI, because there's a lot of data that has to be processed, and it didn't really work. So now these technologies are advancing with a quite heavy pace. Nobody really knows really where we will be in a few years. And this, of course, is a cause for concern. The international community is concerned. And so the idea that, okay, perhaps we have here examples where we intervene into the thinking processes of a person, or we can perhaps read out what a person is thinking, which is partly possible in laboratory stories, but still, don't worry, 10 years away from real-life practice. But so now this right has a renaissance. And the international community has acted already quite in an anticipatory way. There have been some soft law documents, most recently a UNESCO recommendation adopted in November, which is also kind of gesturing at, okay, this could be a freedom of thought issue. Nonetheless, the scope of this right and the scope of protection is very undefined. And at the time where these technologies now become more accessible, perhaps, of course, the big debate starts, yeah, okay, it's a nice right, but should this really be an absolute right? So there are good reasons why we want to read out what people are thinking, think about the terrorist and so on. So now a scholarly debate and also an institutional debate is happening at this moment about if we make freedom of thought into a living right, perhaps we shouldn't have it as an absolute right. And I think this is an interesting debate on a very theoretical level, but that is happening right now. And I think it has a lot of implications. So because even though that's a very abstract question, you can make many inferences from there on. And I think that's a very important idea, at least, to discuss. And when we were asked to bring some practical examples, and when you were asking earlier, who defines human right? I think that's an interesting debate. So, of course, in the end, there must be a court or whoever who applies it. But there's all these shaping operations of rights going on in all these institutions, in the UN institutions and regional institutions, writing reports, giving positions, all these kind of soft law movements are going on at this moment. And this is an angle where we can intervene, in a sense, in different capacities that you are having here as a scholar. You can write about whether this should be an absolute right or whether we should dilute it. And institutions can, bring out reports and so forth. And this shapes kind of like the intellectual climate in which those rights will be then defined at some point. And as I see, Estonia is a member of the UN Human Rights Council. For the next 2 years, there will be one decisive, or I think quite crucial, report in that debate will be the guiding principles in neurotechnologies and human rights. And that report will have to take a position on how strong is the protection of freedom of thought. And I know that the debate is going on there. And so perhaps this could be a point where Estonia is a critical observatory to those ongoing processes. Okay, so this is freedom of thought, but so far this has been very abstract, and this is a technology that will become really problematic only in a couple of years, even though everybody is trying to work on it. I should mention, of course, the usual suspects are all invested. So the leading company, one of the leading companies is Neuralink by Elon Musk. He already does implant these brain chips in patients. It does a lot of great work, so he really helps people with severe neurological problems. But obviously the openly declared point is to put this into healthy people by around 2030. OpenAI, which you all know, has just invested in a new company with a very new approach technologically. So the idea is really to bring the AI into your brain and into your inner dialogue in a much more direct way. So this is like the dystopia on the horizon. Of course, it's all hype. We don't know where this will end up, but I think to have the idea of freedom of thought, at least as a counterbalance, is an interesting thing. So this is the future. If you allow me just to bridge it to the present moment, what is the debate at this moment? Europe, Spain, we want to regulate digital services more harshly, let's say. And I think there's a freedom of thought angle to this. So some scholars, of course, apply freedom of thought to all these social media technologies and say, this undermines freedom of thought. That is probably too easy. If we have an absolute right, all these interventions, they need to be kind of like severe. But states also have other human rights obligations, sometimes neglected, the obligations to fulfill. So roughly saying there are preconditions for the full enjoyment of a right. So an example, if you have a right to food, that not only means that states should hand out food, but also, for instance, that they build a silo or a storage system to put food there in the summer to give it out in the winter, or something like this. So we call this a precondition for the enjoyment of a right. And freedom of thought now has a lot of psychological preconditions, I argue. So, for instance, historically, it's, of course, a right that has to do a lot with reasoning and with reflection and with deep thought, let's call it like this. Perhaps today we would say it should also have more associative, whatever, artistic kind of things. But it also has to do with control over one's thought, attention, and those kind of things. And if one looks at those psychological preconditions, I think you can make an argument that some of the new digital technologies, in the way they are designed and used, might be detrimental to this, because they kind of like advanced certain modes of thought superficial thinking, repetitive stimuli which are only processed very superficially. Everybody is subtly, in a subtle way, addicted to these technologies. Most heavy social media users regret their use. There are studies on this. So there's all kinds of subtle ways by which our mental capacities are weakened, and I think that would at least be enough to say there is a danger here, and there is a freedom of thought argument to be made, at least, that those kind of things should be, let's say, monitored and perhaps regulated by the authorities. And then getting back to Stephanie, DSA would, for instance, be a very good place to regulate these kind of things when we have a human rights systematic risk to fundamental rights. This would be something where we can employ this. So we could do something like a freedom of thought impact assessment and ask the companies to, please make studies, because also empirically we also really don't know how bad social media is yet. That's an open question. It's very hard for psychologists to find this out. So let's ask the companies, please, if you put this on the market, we want to have these studies. So to finish, I think the freedom of thought angle is another angle next to, of course, the democracy problems with amplifying specific voices, and of course all the new kind of things. And also the mental health problem. It's another pillar to build on if we want to regulate the digital technologies. And there's some philosophical twist to it. If you are a believer in free speech, which many of the people who call for the deregulation are, they want to free speech, and they see all these regulations as curbing free speech. If you believe in the value of free speech, I think you must also believe in the value of freedom of thought, because freedom of speech is not just, expressing some sounds. It has to do with the communicative process of several people, and then the marketplace of ideas, if you believe in this metaphor, only works, of course, if whatever somebody says is taken up by someone and processed in the right way. So I say freedom of speech and freedom of thought are internally linked, and the more you say freedom of speech is important, the more you must say freedom of thought is important, which will then always give the justification to regulate at least those kind of aspects. Thank you.
Suur aitäh! Kristof, te pakkusite väga hea platvormi selleks, et paluda siin saalil hääletada. Kes on selle poolt, et piirata või keelata sotsiaalmeedia kasutust alla 16-aastastele? Andke palun käega märku. No kasutage oma mõttevabadust. Kes on selle poolt, et piirata või keelata alla 16-aastastele sotsiaalmeedia kasutus? Hästi, küsime siis nii. Piirata sotsiaalmeedia kasutust. Nüüd küsitakse, et kuidas?
Yeah.
Nii. Vaat, seal me oleme. Väljendusvabadusega on asi raske, aga see on väga hea, et ega see ei olegi kerge küsimus. Hiljuti oli vist Economistis, võin eksida, oli lugu pealkirjaga, ja seda kordavad ka mitte psühholoogid siin samas Eestiski, et sotsiaalmeedia on uus heroiin. Näete, saalist kostab, et õige, isegi halvem. Aga mina ütleks, et võib-olla väga karm, aga kui see on nii, et siis heroiini mõju, te kujutate ette arenevale lapsele, et see on ikkagi märkimisväärne. Palun?
Yeah, so I think we should be very careful with these wrong analogies. I mean, it's something like heroin, but obviously it's something that's not like heroin. And so I think these metaphors don't really help us here if they don't give us something that we understand the world in a better sense. So I think we should say we don't know yet what social media is doing, and I think that we need to find it out. And I think both sides of the debate are kind of like overplaying their hand, because science just doesn't. There are studies in the one direction, studies in the other direction. So I think we have to regulate something where we essentially do not know how bad it is, and that gives a different frame than regulating it as something like heroin, I think.
Soovite kommenteerida keegi?
I'll answer it from a child's rights perspective. It was a conversation we were having at dinner last night, actually, which is the children's rights. So we need to think about children as a rights holder, like us, and not an object of our protection. And that's a mistake that's often being made around children, is that we infantilize them. We want to load in and tell them what they should do. And children's rights perspective takes a complete opposite approach and says, well, let's think about the evolving capacities, that's what's in the law, evolving capacities of the child. And so it might well be that we ban social media altogether for 6-year-olds, but actually as the evolving capacities of the child come through as they evolve, then maybe we need to respect the child's choice to maybe enter into a restricted environment around social media when they hit their early teens, and that they also have choices when they become into their 14, 16. So I think we need to respect them as rights holders as well on this.
Seda on väga südantsoojendav kuulda, sellepärast, et seda on ka meie laste õiguste spetsialistidest kolleegid katsunud selgitada, täpselt nii, nagu justiits- ja digiminister ütles, et väga suur vahe on piiramisel ja keelamisel. Ja meie lisame, et ega laps peab harjuma selle eluga, mis teda ees ootab, ja mida küpsemaks laps saab, seda suurem peab olema tema enda vabadus ja vastutus, ja nii raske, kui see ka ei ole, kõik lapsevanemad teavad, et kui raske on selgitada näiteks teismelisele või eelteismelisele, et miski on kahjulik, siis siiski see on ainukene viis kasvatada hea ja tubli inimene, kes saab oma eluga hakkama, ilma et riik peaks tema eest üle hoolitsema, nagu te väga hästi ütlesite. Aga siin oli üks sõnasoov veel saalist, et kui siia saab kiiresti mikrofon, siis oleks see väga tänuväärne. Võib sellest, ma näen, et aega natuke on ja siis saame pakkuda kiireid lahendusi.
Yes, hello again. I'm Karl-Matti Sepp still, but I actually just wanted to reflect on, well, actually two things. One of the things is that there's a misconception that there are ideas or studies that proclaim that there are also positive sides to the youth for or regarding social media. I haven't really seen any credible ones. I have seen many credible ones that are showing that they exacerbate already pre-existing conditions. Then they also have a lot of inflammatory language. Then they also cause a myriad of other issues. That has been well established now. And they are also going to have many court cases that I think are starting now in California against most of these tech giants because they are being sued in numerous accounts. So that is just like one of the things that social media doesn't really have a proven upside for a lot of young people. And then when there was this most interesting conversation between congressmen and the CEO of TikTok from Singapore, and then they asked, the US congressman asked this CEO from Singapore, asked him, but why are you allowing people or young people to use this app? And then the CEO from Singapore says, but we don't. Under the age of 18, either in China or in Singapore, people are not using this app in the full extent. And then the congressmen are asking the Singaporean, but why are you not doing anything about it? And the CEO from Singapore is just looking back at them, but you are the ones that are making the laws. You are the ones that are allowing people to use this. We never actually wanted children to be able to use this. So that's the main part, that there are certain situations in certain countries that have already taken this regulation to heart, and they are already acknowledging all of the harms that can be done. But that's, my reflections. Other part is like the question about whether this freedom of thought that we uphold in Europe and uphold in the free world, that is actually the greatest tool to undermine our democracies, through propaganda and through disinformation and through whatever type of claims. And the way that then, because we don't have this safeguard of actually defending our space where speech can be used, because everything is supposed to be free speech, then that is very effectively used against us on a daily basis on the level of European Union, on the level of NATO, and on the level of national sovereignty. So that's like two sides. Maybe the youth part. Why are we not doing it the same way that the countries that actually developed these, like example TikTok? And the other part is how can we actually create the space where we are not impeding on people's rights, but we're also not allowing the bad actors to manifest.
See oli, aitäh, väga kena ja kindlasti intrigeeriv kokkuvõte, et arvestades seda, et aega on 2 minutit ja 26 sekundit, et siis siin põhjalikumalt seda teemat ette ei võta, aga ma usun, et need mõtted võetakse kaasa. üldiselt on nii, et ega me ju ei tea ette, mis tuleb, mida pealekasvavad põlvkonnad ise heaks peavad, eks meie ülesanne on neid kaitsta nii hästi, kui oskame kurja eest, aga samas ette valmistada ka selleks eluks, mis neid tegelikult ees ootab, rõõmsal meelel ja kasvatada inimõigusi austavad, vabadust armastavad, vastutustundlikud kodanikud, kes ei pelga ka innovatsiooni ja ei mõtle, et igaks juhuks ei lähe uksestki välja, et äkki muidu juhtub midagi. Lahenduste juurde jõudnud, eks oleks võtnud oma 2 tundi, aga ma usun, et neid lahendusi oli võimalik siit meie vestlusest ka välja noppida ja kõigil teil on tõenäoliselt endal parimad mõtted ja loodan, et need mõtted said natuke paremaks, kui nad enne olid, natuke teravamaks, võib-olla natuke kriitilisemaks, võib-olla natuke rõõmsamaks. Ja usun, et siin on väga hea võtta see teema kokku saalist tulnud mõttega, et näiteks sedasama advanced skip tracing ut ehk siis kadunud, kas pakku läinud või objektiivselt kadunud inimeste otsimise tehnoloogiat, kasutades kõiki võimalikke andmeid, mis on, et kui on olemas näiteks Smart City tehnoloogia, mis on saadud Hiinast, avalikud kaamerad, kõik muud asjad, aga miks mitte kasutada seda selleks, et leida üles need Ukraina lapsed, kes on vägisi oma perede juurest ära viidud, selleks, et nendest kasvatada ukrainlaste vaenlased. Nii et vaadake, jõudsimegi ringiga tagasi sinna, et nii nagu andmeid, nii nagu head vestluskaaslased ütlesid, saab kasutada väga hästi ja kahtlemata väga halvasti, nii saab ka kõiki tööriistu ja tehnoloogiaid, ükskõik kui arenenud nad on, kasutada nii väga headel kui ka väga halbadel eesmärkidel. Ja mulle väga meeldis ka see, et mis siit teie kõikide sõnavõttudest, arvamustest kõlas, et vaatame avatud meelega tulevikku. Need reeglid, mis me kehtestame, peavad olema õiglased, nad ei tohiks olla emotsionaalne ülereageerimine mingile hetkejuhtumile ja nad peaksid olema reaalsuses täidetavad. Ja nad peaks olema enamusele ühiskonnast ka mõistetavad, nii et ei ole vaja riigi sunnijõudu, vaid et inimesed ise mõistavad, et nii on hea, nii on hea. Suur aitäh teile, Stefania, Ben, Nele, Kristof, aitäh kõigile kuulajatele!